All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello and welcome. Thank you for attending the board's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Allison. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Nebraska Board of Engineers and Architects. With me is Amy Habe, the board's Compliance Officer. She will be helping with questions and monitoring the chat box. And also with us is the board executive director, John Wilbeck.
Hello, everybody.
Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the board's YouTube channel. So if you're unable to stay for the whole presentation or want to reference it later, it will be posted on the channel. The slides and templates we go over today will also be available to you should you request them. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, but if you have a question specific to the slide being reviewed, please feel free to type your question into the chat box and we will get to them as we can. Also, everyone is muted for the presentation, so the chat feature is going to be the only way to ask questions during the presentation. For those who participate in the entire presentation, an email will be sent to you next week confirming your attendance and possible use for continuing education credits. I do anticipate the board giving credit for this webinar, but as a reminder, the board does not pre-approve any CE offerings. So let's get started. Today we will be discussing the board, the Nebraska Engineers and Architects Regulation Act, commonly referred to as the Act, and when licensed architects and professional engineers are required to design building projects in Nebraska. So a little bit about who we are. The Nebraska Board of Engineers and Architects has been serving the citizens of Nebraska since 1937 by overseeing the laws and rules governing the practice of engineering and architecture in the state in order to safeguard life, health, property, and promote public welfare.
Hey, Allison, hold on just one second. It looks like some people are having audio issues, so I'm just going to message them and let them know to check their settings. So just, you can keep going, but I just wanted to put that out there that I'll be sending a message.
Some people are having a few people having audio. Russ hears nothing. Okay. Yeah, check your audio settings. You should be here. It seems like it's working for most people.
It's like some people have audio and some
which is
not.
a good thing. Okay.
Is there a certain setting
Allison,
that
why don't you try to jump back in if you
who can hear have just to help out the others?
Allison, I think you can probably keep going. As a reminder for those, and I'll put it in the message box too, that we are recording this. So in the event that you need to go back and reference, you can do that on our YouTube channel following the presentation.
All right, is everyone Okay, we good to keep going?
I think you're good.
Okay. All right, so we discussed who we are, and so we make sure that the statutes and rules are followed in the Nebraska Engineers and Regulation Act. The act contains the statutes and rules that must be adhered to by licensed architects, professional engineers, and members of the public. Our handbook is revised roughly every 2 years and was just recently updated. We are having new handbooks printed and they will be available for distribution here soon. But it is also digitally available on our website. So the board helps to ensure the statutes and rules are being upheld in Nebraska. Our board is comprised of 4 professional engineers, 3 architects, and 1 member of the public. Each member serves a 5-year term and is appointed by the governor. The board has 2 primary missions when it comes to protecting the life, health, and safety of the public. First is ensuring architects and professional engineers are qualified to practice. To do this, the board makes sure individuals applying for licensure have the education, exams, and experience required. Second, the board investigates violations of the act. This could involve incompetence on behalf of a licensee or a member of the public designing and building a structure that requires licensees to be involved in the project's design. So let's review when are architects or professional engineers required on a project. To determine if you need an architect or professional engineer, you must first determine if the project involves the practice of architecture or engineering. So let's define what the practice of architecture and the practice of engineering is. Nebraska statute defines the practice of architecture as providing or offering to provide design services in connection with the construction, enlargement, or alteration of a building or group of buildings in the space within and surrounding the buildings. So as an example, architects are going to look at ADA codes, potential historical requirements, and aesthetics. Nebraska statute defines the practice of engineering as any service or creative work that requires engineering education, training, and experience in the application of special knowledge of the mathematical, physical, and engineering sciences. So engineering will focus more on the math, the calculated weight of materials, the physics behind the structure, structural elements, snow loads, HVAC, and things of that nature. So if you read these 2 definitions and are not sure if a project involves the practice of architecture or engineering, best thing you'll want to do is ask a licensee. So are architects and engineers interchangeable? While much of what architects and professional engineers produce may look similar at times, such as creating plans, designs, drawings, and technical submissions, the practices of architecture and engineering are separate and distinct. Architects cannot practice engineering, and professional engineers cannot practice architecture unless they are licensed to do so. Some projects may require one or both professionals to be involved. So if you determine your project involves the practice of architecture or engineering, the next question you'll need to ask is, does the project qualify for an exemption? So we're going to go over some exemptions and the occupancy classifications. Years ago, our board decided what elements needed to be taken into consideration when determining if a new structure was going to be exempt from requiring a licensee or not. So occupancy classification categorizes structures based on their primary usage, such as a home's main purpose is residential or a hospital's main purpose is healthcare. Knowing the project occupancy classification is the vital first step toward determining if an architect or professional engineer is required. This information is found in the state building code, which is referenced by the board, code officials, and the state fire marshal's office. This information is typically given to you by the state fire marshal or local code official. This is the occupancy classification table that was developed by the board from state law, and this can be found under Board Rule 10.3 in our handbook. As stated previously, the occupancy classification categorizes these structures based on their primary usage. So this is the chart you will use to determine the maximum allowable building area that can be built without a licensed architect or professional engineer. However, many structures will have more than one occupancy classification. In this case, you will use the most restrictive occupancy classification when deciding if you need a licensee involved. So let's look at an example. So here we have an example of a brew pub. As you can see, the building has multiple occupancy classifications. The factory is likely where the beer is made. Hazardous could be where the potentially hazardous materials are stored. Assembly is likely the tasting room. And mercantile is the store where you can buy goods. If we look at the occupancy classification table, we can determine what the most restrictive occupancy classification is for the building. So highlighted are the 4 occupancy classifications from the previous brew pub example. Assembly occupancies have a maximum building area of less than 1,000 square feet. Factory is less than 5,000 square feet. Hazardous is less than 2,000 square feet. And mercantile is less than 3,000 square feet. Since assembly is the most restrictive occupancy classification in this brew pub building, the entire building is then classified as an assembly occupancy. Are there any questions? All right. So next we are going to look at the agricultural exemption. State statute states the provision of the act regulating the practice of engineering and architecture does not apply to the construction, remodeling, alteration, or renovation of farm buildings. Rule 10.2.5 defines a farm building as an agricultural building is defined in state building code. So examples of farm buildings are barns, silos, sheds. These are buildings to house farm animals and farm equipment. Buildings that look like barns and sheds but are used for hosting receptions or something of similar nature like that are not exempt. Those type of buildings are assembly occupancies. Another exemption. So state statute identifies other legally recognized trades as exempt from requiring licensees. For example, a licensed mechanical, electrical, and plumbing trade person doing work within their scope who are competent to do that work would be exempt from the act, meaning you would not be required to retain a professional engineer to design that work. This only applies to mechanical, electrical, and plumbing designs. So Board Rule 10.6 states that if the responsible building official finds a hazard to life, health, safety, or welfare due to the unusual circumstances of the building or structure, or an unusually large number of potential occupants in relation to square footage for a particular occupancy, they may require plans and specifications to be designed and prepared by a licensee. These building officials can be more strict, but not less strict than the act.
Hey, Allison, we have some questions, so let's take a minute here to answer some of these.
Okay.
I believe one of them that's being asked is if an assembly building is 900 square feet and another, I'm assuming occupancy is 2,000 square feet, does it need to be, does that mean it professional engineers and architects are required? So as Allison went over, Rule 10.3 outlines multiple occupancies. If there are multiple occupancies in the building, you have to use the most restrictive occupancy classification. And that entire building is then classified as that most restrictive occupancy. So if you have an assembly building that's over, the entire building is over 1,000 square feet, design professionals likely will need to be involved.
All right, we'll move on to the next.
Hold on, there are a couple more, Allison.
Sorry.
John, feel free to jump in too if you
Yeah.
have any other thoughts.
Okay. Let me scroll up just a tad bit. I think I answered Rich's question. There was another from John for exemptions. Is it the cumulative area or would the facility be exempt if each area was 1 square foot below threshold? So the way we interpret or we usually look at area is the total impacted area. So, and this applies to not only new buildings, but renovations and one-level additions. So we're looking, what the board's rules are looking at is the total impacted area. And if it is, again, if you're, let's say you're building an assembly occupancy classification project and it's 999 square feet, that structure is exempt. No licensees are needed. It is 1 square foot below the threshold. So I think that's a pretty simple answer to your question, John, unless there's some nuance there that I'm not picking up. Let me run through a couple others here. A couple questions from Paul and Sheila about, I think they kind of deal with a little bit of the same thing. Paul asked about calculating the occupant load. Sheila asked how is the table in 10.3 reconcile with the exemptions. So the way Rule 10.3 was created, if you look at the statute that describes the exemptions, 5,000 square feet of less than 20 people, what the board did back in, I believe, 2006 or 7 is they went through a negotiated rulemaking process to come up with what eventually turned into Rule 10.3. And the starting point for Rule 10.3 was the 20 people per occupant for each of those occupancy classifications. So that table in Rule 10.3 is based on the structure that the statutes allow. And so this is kind of an odd situation where the rule kind of supersedes the statute, because the statute allows us to modify the levels, but only going up. So that's what the board did in 2006. They looked at each of those occupancy classifications, and based on the allowable square footage for 20 people in each of those, they determined what the appropriate exemption levels would be. And in cases where they adjusted it, they went up. They made the exemption bigger. So that is kind of a long answer to Paul and Sheila. So really, you don't need to calculate occupant loads. It's very simple. All you do, you first look at 10.3. So the board has already done the occupant calculations for you through the development of that rule. So there's no need to go to statutes. You just go to the rules in Rule 10.3. So I hope that answered Paul and Sheila's question. Vishal has a good question here about mechanical contractors. Are mechanical contractors allowed to design their own projects? Seems this is what we heard in the past. But in the past, it appeared only licensed electrical contractors could sign for their own work. There's an exemption in the law that says, Allison already talked about what the practice definitions are, but there are a couple, they're an exemption for each of those for what we call the licensed trades person exemption. And let me briefly read that.
I think Allison has that in a slide coming up.
Okay. So we'll get to that one when we get there. Let's see. Peter Hind, business occupancy of 2999 square feet, built from an experimental bamboo assembly, 3 stories with an elevator, and 1 stair still exempt. Interesting question. The 3-story is a little bit kind of a snafu, but the way I read the rule is that if it's under 2999 or under 3,000 square feet, Rule 10.3 says that's exempt. Now, I may have to check with our agency legal counsel on that, but that's the way I read the rule, because Rule 10.3, well, actually, let me take that back. So the practice of architecture, for example, talks about when we deal with commercial or industrial buildings, it's 1 story. So I believe in that case, because you're going 2 stories, that it would be subject to the act. Okay, Peter also asked a question. Even if a building is exempt but designed by a registered architect, does it need to be stamped? Not according to our act. Now, there may be a local building official that is more stringent than state law. They can do that. The city of Lincoln or Omaha or a county, they can be more stringent. If an electrical engineer is the only engineer engaged on the project, are they required to stamp the documents? Well, the act says that engineers have to stamp work. If it's not subject to the act, though, it doesn't have to be sealed unless, again, a local jurisdiction or another agency requires it. So I'm not sure if that question about if an electrical engineer is the only engineer, I'm not sure what the nuance is on that one.
I think there's some confusion about the last question here regarding the multiple occupancies.
Mhm.
So again, if there are multiple occupancies in the building, no matter how many occupancies, the total square footage is taken into account. So if you have you have an example of an A, B, and F, so an assembly, business, and factory occupancy all within one building. If the assembly would be the most restrictive occupancy at less than 1,000 square feet. So if that entire building, all three occupancies added together is more than, or is 1,000 or more square feet, then that project is subject to the act. If all three occupancies total less than 1,000 square feet, then the project would likely not be subject to the act. But again, it's the total square footage of the building, not just each separate occupancy. We're gonna, in regards to Robert's question, Allison is going to get to renovations and additions here, and we're gonna go through some examples that I think will answer your questions. So let's get through this, and then at the end, if there's some more questions or clarification that's needed, we can talk about it at that time.
All right, so let's get back to the slide we were at. Bear with me just a moment. All right. So we discussed Board Rule 10.6, with building officials may require plans and specifications to be designed and prepared by a licensee, given a few unusual circumstances. So if you determine your project involves the practice of architecture or engineering and it does not qualify for an exemption, design professionals are going to be required. So we're going to look at renovations and additions. We know we have some questions regarding that, so hopefully this answers some. So there are two major components to look at when renovating or adding an addition. So Rule 10.4 states that renovations and one-level additions to an existing building, structure, or work are exempt from the act if 1, the total impacted area is less than the occupancy classification, and the area of renovation or addition does not adversely impact the mechanical system, electrical system, structural integrity, the means of egress, and does not change or come into conflict with the occupancy classification of the existing or adjacent tenant space, building, structure, or work. So some things that may adversely impact a renovation or addition, maybe moving walls or doorways, and update and changes to the HVAC, structural updates and additions, electrical updates, and occupancy classification changes. Or excuse me, occupancy classification. Occupancy changes, sorry. So let's say someone purchases a 5,000 square foot business occupancy and would like to renovate half of the building. So the renovation includes adding 2 offices and 1 restroom. First is the renovation over the occupancy square foot maximum. Since the maximum square footage for business occupancy is less than 3,000 square feet, and the renovation space is 2,500 square feet, that will not apply as it is less than the business occupancy. So second question, are the mechanical, electrical, or structural systems adversely impacted, or is the egress changing? So in this example, the exterior doors and windows are staying the same. However, the owner wants to move a structural beam within the 2,500 square feet that supports the entire 5,000 square foot building. Therefore, we're now adversely impacting the structure of the entire building, and a licensee may now need to be involved. So another example or an example for an addition, we have a 2,500 square foot addition to a 5,000 square foot building. Both are classified as business occupancy. So again, is the renovation over, or is the addition over the occupancy square foot? And so the maximum square footage again, 3,000 square feet for the business occupancy. So the 2,500 square foot additional space is being built with its own structural support in mind, has separate mechanical and electrical, and no changes to egress. So based on all of this information, a design professional may not need to be involved. But however, let's say that the two buildings share a structural wall, electrical, and mechanical systems, and the exterior door is changed to an interior door. The likelihood that a design professional will need to be involved has greatly increased due to adversely impacting the structural, electrical, mechanical, and changing of the egress. So next we are going to discuss building plans. So who reviews plans?
Before we jump into this, let
sorry.
me ask one question, or try to answer one question from Robert here. This question is about renovating a new occupancy type A, an existing 60s building. So the work you're saying is adversely impacting 1,100 square feet. So if you just look at that, yes, it's subject to the act. But you're only renovating the interior. So no outside, exterior, or structural work performed. Again, you have to kind of run through that list in Rule 10.4 that lists everything. Are you changing the mechanical, electrical? Are you modifying or tying into the existing structure? And so, if you're not doing any outside, exterior, nor structural work, you are doing interior. Likely, again, you'd have to look at if that work constitutes the practice of architecture or engineering, what it is. So I can't give a definitive answer, but you could potentially, and we're measuring square footage. So 1,100 square feet, it definitely could be subject to the act on that, particularly in a type A occupancy.
And then you also have to look at, did the occupancy classification change? So if it was formerly a business occupancy and is now an assembly occupancy, that Rule 10.3 also calls that out as a change in occupancy.
Okay, Jeff's got a good question here too. Can I renovate 2,999 square footage of B occupancy now and come back in a year and renovate the rest of the space? Well, I guess in some alternate universe you could, but I would wonder how, if you're talking about $29.99 now and $29.99 next year, I guess I would question how you could slice it so thin that you could only affect $29.99 and then stay under next year. I'm just not sure you could slice it that fine. Theoretically you could, but I'd be hard pressed to see that. Not a great answer, Jeff. I get it. I get it. Okay, I'm done.
All right, so we'll get back to discussing reviewing business plans. So building plans are seen by many different people and groups, They usually start with zoning administrators, city clerks, and local officials. The state fire marshal will also look at plans to ensure fire safety codes are met. Other entities that may review plans could be city councils and county boards, even banks, lawyers, or financial lenders. Board staff often get asked if we review plans to see if a licensee needs to be involved. The board and staff do not review initial plans for approval or disapproval. So when looking at plans, you may see a seal similar to this one here. The architect seal will have the profession at the top, state of Nebraska at the bottom, and the architect's name and their license number in the middle. Everything needs to be legible, and for this seal to be valid on plans, it must be signed and dated. So a professional engineer seal is very similar to that of an architect's in terms of layout and design, with one difference. So it'll have the words professional and engineer, and with the individual specific discipline, such as civil, structural, or electrical, or any of the other disciplines in the middle. Have the state of Nebraska along the bottom, as well as the professional engineer's name and license number in the middle. Again, text needs to be legible, and for the seal to be valid on plans, it needs to be signed and dated. Professional engineers may practice in disciplines of engineering other than the discipline noted on their seal if they have the education, training, and experience to do so. For example, if a professional engineer licensed as a civil engineer wants to practice as a structural engineer, they would be allowed to do so only if they have the education, training, and experience to do so.
And to clarify that real quick, it's not that a civil engineer wants to practice. They can't state that they're a structural engineer, but if they're doing structural engineering design, they can do so if they're competent to do that work.
All right, so the coordinating professional, this is going to be a licensed professional engineer, landscape architect, or architect recognized as such by the project owner. A coordinating professional is needed when there is more than one professional on the project, such as two professional engineers, one professional engineer, one architect, two architects, and so on. The coordinating professional seal and language signifies the main point of contact for code officials and other professionals and should be on the cover sheet of all technical documents. So this seal and language does not indicate responsible charge or direct supervision of the work. So they will use their Nebraska seal, and then that language below it will also need to be there as well.
Allison, I think we have a couple of questions if we want to run through those really quick.
Okay.
Does one need separate seals for difference of discipline? You need a seal for every discipline or license that you receive. So if you are a professional civil engineer or you're issued a civil engineering license, you will need one that reads professional civil engineer. And if you are also a licensed structural engineer, you will need one for that indicates as the discipline on that seal too.
Yeah. There's another question about, Tim has a good question. Signatures are across the seal. Would that not adversely affect the legibility? It potentially could, but looking at the structure of the statute versus the rule, the statute, which is of a higher authority, says that you put your signature across the seal. So the rules say that they have to be legible. So in this case, the statute it doesn't really trump the seal or trump the rules, but I would strive, if you can, to make it as legible as possible. I've seen a lot of people, if they apply their signature across the seal, they do it in a different color ink, which helps. Blue ink is always good to sign across the seal, and that does help separate the typically, black colored ink in the seal from the signature. So that's it. I think we answered the question about the seals. Or sealed package of drawings, the front and back page need to be sealed by the engineer of record. The statute does say you put the seal and the date of its placement on all technical submissions. And I believe there's a rule that says, so you're talking about sealed package of drawings. So the way the rules are written, I believe it says each drawing which has work has to be sealed. I think it's things like reports, specifications that have kind of a definite beginning on one page and an end on another page. I think those are the ones that are sealed on the first page and the last page. So for drawings, you would seal every sheet on that drawing set. C.W. Harper, out of state. Well, we're getting to that. Temporary permits. Pam, does each discipline need to sign documents in their scope in an engineering design? No. Or does the engineer of record sign for all disciplines? No. The engineer of record, again, remember what the seal is. The seal is that licensee telling whoever's looking at that drawing or document that they are responsible for the work on that sheet. So the engineer of record can't do that for everyone. So in a drawing set, each licensee will put their seal on the drawing that shows their work. If there's a sheet with more than one or with work from more than one licensee, each licensee will seal that sheet and make somehow clear to John Q. Public, who's looking at this drawing, which portion of each of the work each licensee is responsible for. Yeah, John, the board doesn't provide seals anymore. If you need us to prepare an example of what, or you can actually take it from this presentation, but you should have your the title registered professional engineer or registered professional architect. If your seal says that, it's woefully out of date and has been out of date for over 25 years now. So I would update it. Yeah, it's technically invalid. If we come across it, we'll send you a letter just reminding you you're not, this is not disciplinary action, but you should update your seal to say professional, whatever your discipline is, and engineer at the top. And last thing about,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna address Ed. Are you asking about the competency, if a statement's required for that? No. Again, as I stated in the comments, it is up to the licensee to decide, the professional engineer, if they're competent to do that design work in other disciplines. In the event a complaint is brought to the board regarding that competency, the board will investigate it at that time, but we don't ask for verification ahead of time. Ray, yes, digital seals are allowed.
Yeah. Jeff asked, does the date also still need to be on the seal? Yes, it does, per C Rule 6.1.6. Did you answer Joel's question? I can jump in on that one. Do sheets reissued due to modifications during construction need to be sealed, like from change orders? They absolutely do, if that work constitutes the practice of engineering or architecture. Yep, absolutely. Are there an accepted list of disciplines that can or should appear on our seal? Yes, there is. Whatever the current disciplines of NCAAS PE examinations, that's what we put, or that's what we license engineers in. So I believe there's 16, 18, something like that. So those are the disciplines that we license them in.
And to piggyback off that, you should only be producing a seal in which the board has issued you a license for. You don't, even if you're practicing structural engineering as a civil engineer, you don't get to make a structural engineering seal. You have to use the seal in which the board has issued to you.
Yeah. And let me real quickly answer these last two that came in. Pam asked, does Nebraska require instrumentation and control drawings and documents to be sealed by a PE? They do, if that is the practice of engineering, which I can't give a definitive answer based on that. But if it meets the definition or to produce that work requires the practice of engineering as defined in the statute, it would. Jay asks, do you have any guidance on other projects that got high voltage electrical line? Do not see many of these projects with stamps. I will say there is another exemption. I don't know if you're going to get to this in our presentation, but there's a specific exemption for work done, and let me pull it up here. It is work of employees and agents of a political subdivision organized for the purpose of furnishing electrical services. So that's your OPPD, LES, NPPD. Any work that they do does not require or is not subject to the act and therefore doesn't require a seal from us or according to our act. Yeah, Mustafa asked the statement, your seal needs to have the discipline of your license at the top of it. So I'll stop there.
All right, so next we're going to look at temporary permits. So if an applicant holds a current and valid license issued by a licensing authority in another jurisdiction that is recognized by the board, they may apply for a temporary permit for the purpose of providing service on a single project not to exceed 2 years. In the event the project lasts longer than 2 years, that temporary permit holder must obtain a Nebraska license. So the architect or professional engineer holding a temporary permit will use their seal from the state of verified licensure when sealing documents pertaining to the Nebraska project and must accompany the seal with the template used by the board. So they'll also, below their seal, have their name, permit number, expiration date, project name, and project location. So when should plans be sealed? When presented to a client, public, or governmental agency, including when submitting for a permit. Should be sealed on all originals, copies, tracings, and reproducible drawings, as well as on the first and last page of specifications, reports, and studies. So documents clearly marked draft, prepared for preliminary submission and review, do not require the professional seal, signature, and date, including documents prepared for a client or governmental agency unless otherwise required by that entity. So this information needs to be clearly identified in an obvious language. When bidding out projects, you may get plans from construction companies and they should bear this language. So next we're going to look at enforcement. So the board gets complaints in a variety of ways, Majority of complaints come from other state agencies and from the public. Anyone can file a complaint with the board, even if they're out of state. The board has received complaints from property owners, city and state officials, clients, architects, and professional engineers. Some complaints include when architects and professional engineers are not involved in projects that are not exempt from the act, the projects have invalid seals, and there could be a possibility of professional misconduct. So complaints can be filed with the board after completing our complaint form. It's a 2-page form that's available on our website. All of the information remains anonymous. Any contracts, technical documents, or other evidence supporting your complaint can also be submitted. Providing as much information as possible is very helpful to the board. So we work with a number of other agencies to uphold our mission and goals. By working with these other agencies and officials across the state, we ensure we're getting out the correct information to the correct people so that the public is better informed and served. So we work with DHHS, the state fire marshal, local building officials, and Department of Environment and Energy, just to list a few. So once the board receives a complaint that a person or organization is alleged to have violated the act, the compliance officer will reach out to the complainant to gather more information. So once this process is all gone through, the information is all gathered and will be presented to the board. The board has the option to close the complaint or initiate a case and continue investigating the complaint or authorize remediation on the process. So Board Rule 8.4 covers this remediation process. This involves the project owner bringing in an architect or professional engineer to identify deficiencies. If deficiencies are identified, licensee will submit a letter to the board and the project owner outlining the deficiencies and options for correction. The project owner must remove the deficiencies identified by the remediation professionals. Once the project has been remediated, the remediation licensees complete a final letter to the board stating so. If no deficiencies are found, the licensee will inform the board and the complaint is typically closed. So under Nebraska statute, if a person or organization has committed a violation, one or more of the following actions may be taken against such person or organization. So any of these penalties are an option. The board usually does not take action, but if someone chooses not to comply with the process and have the professional come out to review the project, the board has the ability to take action against the project owner. Among these actions, the board can impose civil penalties of $10,000 for each offense and can impose a cease and desist order on the project. So following the act can help protect property, persons on that property, and to prevent damage or liability from improperly constructed buildings. Not only does following the act help protect life, health, and safety, but it can save project owners money and time on these projects. When the act isn't followed, property owners and developers may be liable if a structure was built in violation and subject to fines and civil penalties authorized by state statute. So next we're just going to discuss some resources that we have available. We understand that navigating these rules and regulations can take a while, so we have these available for you on our website, as well as you can request them free of charge. So we have a couple flow charts to help on deciding whether or not you need an architect or professional engineer. We have one for a new construction project, as well as a new renovation or addition project. So again, if you want any of these copies, please feel free to, you can request them through they're on the website, digital copies, or you can send an email as well. I believe Amy has posted that in the chat. One of our most used resources is going to be our licensee lookup feature. If you need to consult with a licensee that lives nearby you, or you're wanting to confirm someone's license, this is where you're going to want to go. So you can search for the architect or professional engineer. When using this section, the less information you fill out, the better results you're going to get. We recommend to start with the type of licensee you're looking for, as well as your zip code to find one close to you. Again, we also have a frequently asked questions tab, looking at questions regarding if you need an architect or professional engineer, and questions for the public, licensees, and students. We are going through a little bit of a reconstruction on some of these, so if you're not finding maybe what exactly you're looking for under the frequently asked questions, I recommend going and looking under kind of the respective topic you're looking for. So if an engineer's looking for a question on continuing education, I recommend using that engineers tab. We also have our publications and resources underneath the latest news and resources tab of our website. There you'll find our handbooks, some brochures, our blog, and flow charts. And again, we have digital copies, or you can request them free of charge and we will send them to you. Again, give us a follow on all of our social media to stay up to date with information and updates. So if you need further assistance or want any copy of the materials, you can contact me at the number and email listed here. Anyone have any other questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for attending. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Yes, we will be sending out information or confirmation next week about attendance for this webinar.